Lance Hopkins had spent his entire life working the land, waking up before dawn to tend to his farm, watching the sun rise over the rolling fields, feeling the earth beneath his calloused hands. It wasn't just a livelihood for him, it was his legacy. His grandfather had built this farm from nothing, and his father had fought to keep it alive during the toughest times. Now, it was Lance's turn to carry on the tradition, to ensure that the land remained productive, healthy, and, most importantly, his. Every acre was accounted for, every fence post hammered in with purpose, every grain silo standing as a testament to decades of hard work. He had poured everything into this farm, and the thought of anyone trying to take it from him was unimaginable. But when he pulled onto his property after a supply run to the nearest town, something immediately felt wrong. The dirt road leading up to his farmhouse was lined with cars, dozens of them mud-splattered CUVs, pickup trucks, even a few old camper vans. At first he thought there might have been some kind of accident, that maybe some city folks had gotten lost and were using his land as an impromptu parking lot. But as he drove further, his stomach tightened. The cars weren't abandoned. People were walking freely across his fields, some of them carrying equipment, others setting up what looked like makeshift tents. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he pulled up to the main house. He barely had time to put the truck in park before a woman approached with an unsettlingly wide smile. He recognized her immediately, Karen Berkeley. She had always been a nuisance, the self-appointed leader of a nearby homeowners group that had long tried to extend their reach beyond their neighborhood's boundaries. She was the kind of person who believed she was entitled to control everything around her, the kind who saw land not as something owned and cultivated, but as something that should be managed by those with the right vision. "Welcome back, Lance," Karen called out, spreading her arms as if she had just reunited with an old friend. Lance stepped out of his truck slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel as he surveyed the scene. There were at least 30 people scattered across his property, some setting up what looked like information booths, others unloading crates filled with pamphlets, food, and supplies. It wasn't just a gathering, it was an organized event. "What the hell is going on here?" Karen's voice was controlled but firm, the tone of a man who wasn't in the mood for games. Karen clasped her hands together and gave a small, knowing laugh, as if she had expected his reaction. "Oh, Lance, don't be so dramatic. We're launching something truly special here, a community initiative. A return to the land, a place where people can reconnect with nature, learn the values of sustainable living, and—" "This is my farm," he cut in, his patience thinning with every passing second. "You have no right to be here." Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened, as if she found his resistance amusing. "Oh, but that's where you're mistaken. You see, this land has a long history, and under certain provisions related to community development, it has been designated as a potential shared use space. We've been working with some very knowledgeable people, and according to our research, this property—" Lance took a step forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "This land belongs to me. I have the deed, the records, everything proving that." Karen waved a hand dismissively. Yes, legal ownership, of course. But land isn't just about paperwork, Lance. It's about stewardship, about responsibility. And, quite frankly, you've been keeping all this space to yourself when it could be benefiting so many others. Don't you see the potential here?" He glanced over her shoulder. Several people had started hammering wooden stakes into the ground, marking off sections as if they were claiming territory. Others had already set up tables covered with hand-written signs advertising organic farming workshops and sustainable living education. A large canvas banner flapped in the breeze, displaying the words Community Land Initiative in bold, green letters. Lance's jaw clenched. "You need to pack all this up and leave. Now." Karen's expression shifted, but only slightly. The smile remained, but there was a sharpness in her eyes now, a flicker of something calculating. "Lance, let's not be hasty. This is already in motion. We've got people coming in from out of state. Some of them have already made donations, invested in this project. We've spoken with environmental groups, legal consultants." "You mean you found a bunch of people dumb enough to fall for this scam?" Lance interrupted, his voice like gravel. Her expression hardened for the briefest moment before she composed herself. "Oh, Lance, you're thinking so small. This is bigger than you. bigger than any one person. His patience snapped. I don't care how big you think this is. I want you and your people off my land before I start making phone calls. Karen exhaled through her nose, her smile finally faltering. You're not being very cooperative, Lance. That's disappointing. Before he could respond, another man approached one of Karen's people, a wiry guy in khakis and a button-up shirt, the kind who looked like he spent more time giving presentations than doing real work. Karen, he said quietly but loud enough for Lance to hear, should we move forward with the transitional phase? Lance's fingers curled into fists. What the hell is the transitional phase? Karen turned back to him with a look of exaggerated patience. It's just a term we use for when a project like this needs a little time to, well, settle in. You see, Lance, you can fight this, but you're up against something much larger than yourself. There are procedures, regulations, things that frankly you might not fully understand. If you're smart, you'll realize that cooperating is in your best interest. Lance let out a slow, steady breath. Get off my land. Karen sighed, shaking her head as if she were the disappointed parent of a stubborn child. I was really hoping we could do this the easy way. At that moment, Lance noticed something that made his blood run cold. Near the barn, one of the so-called volunteers was unhooking the latches on one of his livestock pens. The gate swung open, and several of his cattle, startled by the sudden movement, began to scatter. He didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel and stormed toward them, his boots kicking up dust as he shouted, "Get the hell away from my animals." But as he did, he heard Karen call out behind him, her voice dripping with fake regret, "Now, Lance, if you start acting aggressively, you're only going to make things harder for yourself." He ignored her. His vision tunneled as he sprinted toward the barn, his focus solely on containing the situation, but deep down, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a takeover. And Karen had no intention of leaving without a fight. Lance had dealt with his fair share of headaches over the year's droughts, broken equipment, stubborn livestock, and even the occasional dispute with nosy neighbors who didn't understand that a working farm wasn't some picturesque tourist attraction. But this was something entirely different. This was an invasion, and Karen knew exactly what she was doing. As he reached the barn, his boots kicking up dust, he barely had time to process the sight of his cattle pushing through the now open gate, spooked by the commotion. The man responsible, a bearded guy in a Patagonia vest who looked like he'd never worked a real day in his life, had the audacity to look offended when Lance shoved him aside and grabbed the swinging gate, slamming it shut with enough force to rattle the wooden frame. The cattle had already scattered across the field, their anxious movements kicking up dirt, but at least the rest of them wouldn't be let loose. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lance growled, his voice low and controlled but laced with unmistakable fury. The man straightened his shirt, looking around as if hoping someone would come to his defense. "We were just creating a more open, natural environment for the animals," he stammered, barely able to meet Lance's glare. Lance took a step forward, towering over him. "You don't touch my property. You don't touch my animals. You don't so much as breathe near my barn without my permission." Before the man could stammer out another excuse, Karen's voice rang out from behind him, sickly sweet and calculated. "Now, Lance, let's not get aggressive. We wouldn't want this to escalate, would we?" Lance turned slowly, his patience hanging by a thread. Karen stood at the edge of the field, arms folded, her expression carefully composed, but there was a glint of satisfaction in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "You've got two choices," Karen, Lance said, keeping his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Either you pack up your little circus and get off my land, or I start calling the sheriff's department and have every last one of you trespassers hauled out of here." Karen sighed dramatically, shaking her head. "Oh, Lance, you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. We could be working together. We could be creating something truly special here." Lance had heard enough. He pulled his phone from his pocket and started dialing, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He didn't care if the sheriff's office tried to brush this off as a civil matter. He was done playing games. But before the call could go through, Karen's tone shifted, her voice dropping into something quieter, more pointed. "You might want to reconsider that." Lance didn't respond, but his grip on the phone tightened. Karen took a slow step forward, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "I'm sure you think this is just some little stunt, but you're underestimating how far we've already gotten. You see, while you were busy minding your business, real progress was being made. We've filed a petition with the county zoning board. We've got an application pending for historical land designation. And most importantly, we've had some very productive conversations with people who have the authority to make changes that you might not like." Lance narrowed his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" Karen tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "Did you know that there's an old land survey from decades ago that suggests parts of this property may not have been properly registered under your family's name? It's a shame, really. Record-keeping back then wasn't what it is now, and unfortunately, these things have a way of coming back up at the worst times." Lance's jaw clenched. This was bullshit. He had all the necessary paperwork, all the documentation proving his ownership. But Karen wasn't trying to prove anything. She was trying to create just enough confusion, just enough bureaucratic noise to cause problems. Karen smiled, sensing his hesitation. "Now, of course, we wouldn't want to disrupt your life, but if we end up in a legal battle over land use rights, environmental impact assessments, and zoning regulations, well, that could take years, couldn't it? Years of court fees, inspections, and restrictions on what you can and can't do with your own land." Lance exhaled sharply through his nose, his pulse pounding in his ears. He'd known Karen was manipulative, but this was something else entirely. She wasn't just trying to squat on his land, she was trying to bury him in legal red tape, forcing him into a battle that she hoped would wear him down until he had no choice but to give up. Or, Karen continued, her voice dripping with false generosity, "You could work with us. Embrace the vision. This land has so much potential, and with the right cooperation, it could be something extraordinary. We could even discuss some kind of shared management agreement. You'd still be here, of course. You just have a little guidance in how things are run." Lance had heard enough. He turned his phone back on, dialing the sheriff's department again, but before he could hit call, Karen's smirk deepened. "I wouldn't waste your time," she said smoothly. "We had a lovely chat with the sheriff last week. He's quite sympathetic to community initiatives, you know. Very forward-thinking. You'll probably just end up with a mediation request rather than any actual action. And in the meantime, well, we'll still be here." Lance's stomach turned. He knew exactly what she was doing. She was making it clear that she had already set the stage, that she had prepared for every move he could make. The legal filings, the conversations with officials, the calculated manipulation of records, she had spent months planning this, positioning herself in a way that made it nearly impossible for him to simply force her out. For the first time since this insanity began, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. What if she had actually found some loophole? What if she had convinced the right people to throw obstacles in his way? He didn't have time for a years-long legal battle. He had a farm to run, animals to take care of. Karen saw the hesitation in his face and pounced. "Lance, we don't have to be adversaries. This doesn't have to be difficult. All you have to do is accept that change is inevitable. You can be part of something bigger, or you can fight a losing battle." Lance stared at her for a long moment, then turned his gaze back to his land. His land. The fields his father had walked, the barns his grandfather had built with his own 2 hands. The thought of letting someone like Karen take even a fraction of it made his blood boil. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. "You're right about one thing," he said finally. "This doesn't have to be difficult." Karen's smile widened. "I knew you'd come around." Lance's voice was calm but firm, his next words cutting through the air like a blade. "I'll handle this my way." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Lance had already turned, walking toward his truck. He didn't need the sheriff. He didn't need to argue. He needed a plan, one that didn't just push Karen off his land, but made damn sure she never came back. Because if Karen wanted a war, she had just found one. Lance didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the old wooden surface that had seen years of late-night bookkeeping, early morning coffee and quiet conversations with his father before the weight of the farm had passed entirely onto his shoulders. Outside, the security light over the barn cast long shadows across the field, flickering slightly as moths battered themselves against the bulb. He could hear the faint sound of voices from across the property, the intruders still moving about, still digging themselves deeper into his land. He could see the distant glow of campfires near the tree line, the figures of Karen's followers illuminated as they moved like ghosts through the darkness. The fact that they were still here, even after everything he'd said, made his blood simmer with anger. But anger wasn't going to solve this. If Karen had spent months planning this, then charging in without a strategy would be exactly what she wanted. No, he had to be smarter. He had to think like she did, like someone who knew how to twist rules, manipulate systems, and play the long game. He had always prided himself on being the kind of man who solved problems with his hands, with hard work and persistence, but this wasn't a broken fence or a sick animal. This was war, just fought on a different kind of battlefield. He spent the early hours of the morning making calls. First to his lawyer, waking the man up with a voice that left no room for excuses. He needed every document, every title deed, every scrap of proof that this land was his and had been for generations. He wanted to know exactly what Karen had filed, exactly what claims she had made, and exactly what loopholes she was trying to exploit. Next, he called the zoning office, demanding records of any petitions, any pending reviews, anything with Karen's name attached to it. He wasn't going to let her operate in the shadows. By sunrise, he had the beginnings of a plan. It wasn't about brute force, it was about control. Karen thought she had the upper hand because she had set the rules of the game before he even realized he was playing. But the thing about people like her was that they always got comfortable, always assumed they were smarter than everyone else. She had built her foundation on bureaucracy and manipulation, but Lance was about to remind her that the land itself didn't answer to paperwork. He started by locking everything down. The main water supply to the barn, shut off. The electrical feed running to the outer sections of the property, disconnected. He knew that at least some of the squatters were relying on his infrastructure, using his land like it was a resource they were entitled to. He wanted them uncomfortable. He wanted them to start questioning whether Karen really had everything under control. Then he made sure the property itself was a problem for them. He opened the irrigation channels near their tents, letting the water soak into the ground, turning their neat little encampments into soggy, unusable mud pits. He let the cattle loose in the outer pastures, knowing full well that most of Karen's people had no experience with large animals and would panic at the sight of them moving freely through what they thought was their territory. And just for good measure, he started clearing brush around the perimeter with his tractor, sending a deafening roar through their camp before the sun was even fully up. If they wanted to act like they belonged here, they were going to have to live with what that actually meant. By mid-morning, the cracks were already forming. Karen's people weren't hardened survivalists, they were weekend warriors, suburban idealists who thought they could play at being pioneers without understanding what that actually required. They didn't like getting dirty, didn't like waking up in soaked sleeping bags, didn't like the idea of sharing space with animals that didn't know or care about their delusions of community living. The first few packed up and left before breakfast, slipping away without much fuss, probably rationalizing to themselves that they had done their part and contributed to the cause in some vague, meaningless way. Karen, of course, didn't waver. She doubled down, gathering those who remained and rallying them with speeches about perseverance and shared struggle, spinning the situation into some grand battle between the forces of progress and the tyranny of outdated, selfish landowners. But Lance could see the strain. He could see the way she gritted her teeth when another car pulled away, the way she kept glancing toward him whenever he was in sight, like she was trying to gauge just how much control she actually had. And then she made her next move. That afternoon, 2 county inspectors showed up at his gate, armed with clipboards and officious expressions. Karen had wasted no time filing complaints, environmental violations, improper livestock management, potential safety hazards. It was a transparent attack, a way to slow him down, to force him to focus on defending himself rather than driving them out. But Lance had seen it coming. He met them at the entrance with every document they could possibly ask for. Permits, inspection reports, Veterinary records, everything was up to code. Everything was accounted for. He walked them through the property with the confidence of a man who had nothing to hide, countering every question with undeniable facts. He even had his own expert, a local agricultural consultant he had called in that morning there to verify that every accusation was baseless. By the time the inspectors left, Karen's frustration was palpable. She had been counting on this to be a battle of attrition, hoping that if she threw enough obstacles in his way, he would eventually break. But she hadn't expected him to be ready for it, hadn't expected him to meet her bureaucratic warfare with his own meticulous preparation. That night, the situation escalated again. Lance had just finished securing the barn when he heard something that sent a chill through his spine. Laughter, but not the kind that came from friendly conversation. It was sharp, mocking, coming from the direction of his house. He moved quickly, stepping onto the porch, and what he saw made his stomach drop. His front door was wide open. A group of Karen's people stood outside, watching, waiting for his reaction. One of them, tall, smug, the same man who had tried to open the cattle pen, was holding something in his hand. Lance's grandfather's old hunting rifle. It wasn't loaded. It had never been anything more than a relic, something Lance had kept as a piece of history, a connection to the past. But that didn't matter. The sight of it in someone else's hands, the audacity of them stepping into his home, touching what wasn't theirs, it ignited something primal, something deeper than anger. He took a slow step forward, and the group shifted slightly, as if suddenly realizing that this wasn't just some harmless prank. "Put it down," Lance said, his voice so calm it was almost a whisper. The man hesitated, looking toward Karen, who had just arrived, standing a few feet behind them. Lance's eyes never left him. "I won't say it again." The man's fingers tightened around the rifle for a fraction of a second before he seemed to think better of it. He lowered it, setting it down on the porch railing, taking a small step back. Karen took that moment to intervene, stepping forward with that same sickly sweet smile. "Lance, let's not overreact. It was just a misunderstanding." Lance didn't answer. He simply picked up the rifle, turned, and walked inside, shutting the door behind him. He locked it. Then he grabbed his real gun. Karen thought this was a game. She thought she was dealing with someone she could intimidate, manipulate, or wear down with paperwork and petty harassment, but she had just made a mistake. A big one. Because she had forgotten one simple truth. This wasn't her land, and Lance was done playing nice. Lance sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The engine idled, the familiar rumble grounding him as his mind raced through the events of the last 24 hours. They had broken into his house. They had touched things that weren't theirs. It wasn't just about land anymore, it wasn't even about control. This was personal. Karen had taken this beyond a dispute over property lines and turned it into a full-scale invasion. She had made it clear that she wasn't going to back down, that she was willing to escalate things to a level he hadn't anticipated, and that meant he had to be ready for whatever came next. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think instead of react. That was the mistake she wanted him to make, to lash out, to do something reckless, something she could twist into a justification for legal action or worse. But she had miscalculated. She thought she was dealing with a man who would break under pressure, who would cave the moment the fight became too much to handle. What she didn't realize was that Lance had spent his entire life dealing with challenges, with setbacks, with people and circumstances that tried to take from him what he had built. He wasn't going to let a woman with a clipboard and an inflated sense of self-importance be the thing that finally brought him down. He picked up his phone and dialed. His lawyer answered on the second ring, his voice groggy from sleep, but Lance didn't have time for pleasantries. He laid out everything: the break-in, the stolen rifle, the continued harassment, the county inspections that Karen had somehow arranged in record time. His lawyer listened, interrupting only to ask for specific details, before finally sighing heavily. "This is worse than I thought," the man admitted. "She's not just squatting, she's orchestrating a full-scale legal entanglement. She's trying to mire you in so much red tape that by the time you clear one accusation, she'll have filed 2 more. Lance clenched his jaw. "So what do we do?" There was a pause. You fight her on every front. You counter every claim, every petition, every zoning request. But more importantly, you make sure she doesn't get comfortable. She's operating under the assumption that you'll follow the rules, that you'll play by the book while she bends it to suit her needs. You need to remind her that this is your land, that you control the conditions, not her. Lance didn't need to be told twice. He hung up, his mind already forming a plan. By the time the sun began to rise, he was already at work. The first thing he did was reinforce the perimeter. He spent the morning welding additional locks onto the barn and storage sheds, making sure that there wasn't a single structure left vulnerable to Karen's people. He replaced the batteries and the motion sensor lights, ensuring that every inch of the property would be illuminated the moment anyone set foot where they didn't belong. He even took the time to install a few additional cameras, the kind that streamed directly to his phone, giving him real-time access to everything happening on his land. Then he went on the offensive. He filed his own complaints, targeting every technicality he could find. If Karen wanted to play the game of bureaucracy, then he was going to bury her in paperwork. He reported unauthorized gatherings on private property. He flagged the sudden increase in traffic on rural roads as a potential safety hazard. He even submitted a formal complaint about the waste management issue Karen's camp was inevitably creating, knowing full well that the health department would have no choice but to investigate. By midday, the first signs of disruption were starting to show. Some of Karen's followers were growing restless, frustrated by the increasing difficulty of simply existing on land that wasn't designed to accommodate them. The lack of electricity, the limited water supply, the ever-present stench of livestock, it was all beginning to wear on them. Lance could see it in their faces as he rode past on his ATV, their expressions shifting from determination to discomfort, from righteous defiance to quiet uncertainty. Karen, of course, was still holding strong, but there was a tension in her now that hadn't been there before. She was starting to realize that Lance wasn't just going to roll over and let her take what she wanted. That night, the escalation reached a boiling point. Lance had just finished checking the security feeds when he heard something, an unnatural sound, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet of the farm like a blade. He grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline beginning to surge through his veins. He scanned the property, his trained eyes immediately catching the flicker of movement near the tree line. Then he saw it. The fire. A section of his field was burning, the dry grass catching quickly, the flames licking hungrily at the night sky. It wasn't a large fire, not yet, but that didn't matter. The intent was clear. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. He moved fast, grabbing the emergency hose he kept near the barn, his hands working quickly to douse the flames before they could spread. The fire hadn't had time to gain much ground, and within minutes, it was out, leaving behind only a patch of scorched earth and the acrid smell of smoke hanging heavy in the air. Lance turned toward the direction the fire had started, his gaze cold, calculating. Someone had done this. Someone had walked onto his land in the dead of night and set a fire, knowing exactly what kind of damage it could have caused. And there was no doubt in his mind who was behind it. The next morning, he rode out to Karen's camp. She was waiting for him, standing with her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral. But he could see the slight lift of her chin, the barely concealed satisfaction in her eyes. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice low even. She tilted her head slightly, feigning innocence. "Whatever do you mean, Lance?" His fingers flexed against the reins of his horse, his patience running thin. "You think I don't know what you did?" Karen's smile didn't falter. "I think you're grasping at straws. Fires happen, especially on dry land like this. Maybe you should be more careful with your property." Lance held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "I should be more careful. And so should you." For the first time, something flickered in her expression: uncertainty, hesitation. Lance didn't wait for her to respond. He turned his horse and rode back toward his house, already knowing what he needed to do next. Karen had made her move, and now it was time for him to make his. This wasn't just about reclaiming his land anymore. This was about ending the fight before she had the chance to escalate it even further. and Lance had every intention of making sure that when the dust settled, there would be no question about who the land truly belonged to. Lance woke up before dawn, his body operating on instinct, his mind still replaying the events of the night before. The fire had been a warning, a carefully calculated move designed to rattle him, to make him second-guess himself, to force him into a mistake. But Karen had underestimated him. He had spent too many years fighting against the elements, too many seasons battling droughts, storms, and wild predators to be scared off by something as transparent as an arson attempt. If anything, it only confirmed what he had suspected all along. Karen was running out of options. She had expected him to fold, to give up and let her take what she wanted without a fight. Instead, she had realized too late that he wasn't just resisting, he was winning. The camp had already started to thin out, with more and more of her people packing up and leaving under the cover of darkness. The reality of living on a working farm with no electricity, no running water, and a growing hostility from the man who actually owned the land had started to sink in. The ones who remained were the true believers, the ones Karen had completely indoctrinated into her twisted vision of community living. They were the most dangerous kind people who had convinced themselves they were fighting for something greater than themselves, who saw every setback as a challenge, every failure as an opportunity to double down. Lance didn't bother waiting for the sun to fully rise before making his next move. He saddled his horse and rode straight to the county offices, arriving just as the doors opened. He had spent the night gathering every piece of paperwork he could find: survey records, ownership documents, tax receipts, anything that could be used to shut down whatever nonsense Karen had filed. He wasn't just going to fight her claims. He was going to erase them from existence. The clerk at the zoning office recognized him immediately, offering a sympathetic nod as he handed over the files. "We've been getting a lot of complaints about this situation," she admitted, flipping through the paperwork. "People in town aren't happy about what she's doing out there." "That makes two of us," Lance said dryly. She scanned one of the documents, her brow furrowing. "You're going to want to see this," she muttered, turning her monitor toward him. Lance leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he took in the screen. It was a digital record of a newly submitted petition, Karen's latest attempt at seizing control of his land. But this one was different. She had changed tactics. Instead of trying to claim the property outright, she had filed for a temporary conservatorship, citing environmental concerns and the historical significance of the land. If it went through, it wouldn't take away his ownership, but it would severely restrict what he could do with his own property, giving her and her people an excuse to remain indefinitely. Lance exhaled sharply, forcing down the rage that threatened to rise in his chest. She was smart, he'd give her that. She knew she couldn't win outright, so she was trying to shift the battlefield, creating new obstacles faster than he could knock them down. But she had made a crucial mistake. She had assumed he would play by the same rules she did. By the time he left the office, he had everything he needed. He had spoken with county officials, filed his own counterclaims, and scheduled an expedited hearing to dispute Karen's petition before it could gain any traction. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, but he was cutting through it as fast as he could, making sure there wouldn't be any loopholes left for her to exploit. When he returned to the farm, he found Karen waiting for him. She was standing near the entrance, her arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her elbow. The way she kept glancing toward the remaining members of her group, as if reassuring herself that she still had control. "You've been busy," she said lightly as he dismounted. "So have you," Lance replied, his voice cold. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I hear you've been making quite a fuss down at the county offices. That's disappointing. I was hoping we could settle this between us, without bringing in all that unnecessary red tape." Lance laughed, the sound short and humorless. "You mean the same red tape you've been trying to use to steal my land?" Karen sighed, shaking her head as if he were a stubborn child refusing to see reason. "Lance, you're looking at this all wrong. This isn't about taking anything from you. This is about sharing, about creating something bigger than one man's outdated idea of ownership." His jaw tightened. "I don't share with thieves." Her expression flickered, just for a second, before she regained control. "That's unfortunate," she said quietly. Because you're running out of options. Lance took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. No, Karen, you are. For the first time, he saw genuine uncertainty in her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, there was a commotion from the direction of the camp, shouting. A loud crash. The sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Karen turned, her mask of control slipping as she hurried toward the noise, and Lance followed, his instincts kicking in. When they reached the camp, it was chaos. One of the makeshift structures, a half-built shed that Karen's people had been constructing as a community gathering space, had collapsed, its wooden beams splintered, the tarp roof sagging in on itself. A group of people stood around it, some arguing, others frantically trying to dig through the wreckage. And then Lance saw the blood. One of Karen's followers, a man in his 20s, his idealism still fresh and unbroken, was pinned beneath the wreckage, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his face pale from shock. Someone was pressing a jacket against his head, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was already too much of it, pooling in the dirt, staining the ground beneath him. Karen's face had gone pale. Lance moved before he even realized what he was doing, pushing through the crowd, dropping to his knees beside the injured man. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the fact that this was one of Karen's people, that this was someone who had been complicit in trying to take what wasn't theirs. Right now, none of that mattered. He worked quickly, assessing the injuries, stabilizing the man's leg as best he could while barking orders at the people around him. Call an ambulance. Now. No one moved. Lance looked up, his expression sharp. I said call an ambulance finally. Someone fumbled for a phone, their hands shaking as they dialed. Karen knelt beside him, her composure cracking. This wasn't supposed to happen. Lance didn't respond. He focused on the injured man, on keeping him conscious, on preventing the situation from getting worse. But in the back of his mind, he knew. This was it. This was the moment that would break her. Karen had built her entire campaign on control, on the illusion that she knew exactly what she was doing, that she was the one holding all the cards. But now, in the face of real consequences, real danger, she was floundering. Lance didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to remind her that this was her fault, that she had pushed too far, that she had let her arrogance blind her to the reality of what she was doing. She already knew. And for the first time since this all began, Lance saw fear in her eyes. Lance stood back as the paramedics loaded the injured man into the ambulance, his legs stabilized, his head wrapped in gauze to stop the bleeding. The camp had fallen into a hushed silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on everyone like a storm cloud ready to break. No one spoke, no one moved, as if they were collectively waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't just some utopian experiment, some noble crusade to reclaim land for the people. This was dangerous. This was real. Karen was standing a few feet away, her face pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the ambulance disappear down the dirt road. She looked smaller now, as if the confidence, the arrogance that had carried her this far had been stripped away in an instant. Lance could see the wheels turning in her head, the desperate attempt to find a way to spin this, to reframe it into something she could control. But there was no way to talk her way out of this. A man had nearly died because of her. And for the first time since this whole thing started, she had nothing to say. Lance wasn't going to let this moment slip away. He turned to face the remaining members of Karen's group, his voice steady, firm, leaving no room for argument. This ends now, he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. You all need to pack up and get off my land before this gets worse. There was no immediate response. Some of them still looked defiant, unwilling to let go of the dream they had bought into. But most of them, the ones who had seen the blood, who had felt the panic of watching one of their own go down, were already on the edge of breaking. Karen took a slow step forward, her voice quieter than usual, lacking the authority it once carried. Lance, we can fix this. We don't have to let this. You don't get to fix anything, he interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. You've been running this scam for months, convincing these people that you had a plan, that you knew what you were doing. But you don't. you never did." Her lips pressed together, her jaw tightening, but she didn't argue. She knew she couldn't. Lance turned back to the crowd. "You've all got an hour. After that, I start making calls. And if any of you are still here when law enforcement shows up, I guarantee you won't like what happens next." There was hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty, but then, slowly, someone turned and started packing. Another followed, and another. Within minutes, the movement spread like wildfire, people breaking down tents, loading up their cars, pulling stakes from the ground. The illusion had been shattered. Without Karen's unwavering confidence to hold it together, the entire operation was crumbling. Karen stood frozen, watching as everything she had built unraveled before her eyes. "You don't understand," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "This was supposed to be something bigger." Lance shook his head. "No, Karen. This was always just about you." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a brief second he thought he saw something almost like regret. But it didn't matter. Whatever justification she had built in her mind, whatever story she had told herself to make this seem righteous, it was over now. The exodus was quick, frantic, as if the people who had followed her were suddenly desperate to distance themselves from everything they had been a part of. By the time the sun began to set, the camp was nearly empty, nothing left but tire tracks in the dirt, and a few scattered remnants of their failed revolution. Lance watched Karen as she stood by her car, staring at the wreckage of her ambitions. He expected her to say something, to make one last attempt to twist the narrative in her favor, but she didn't. She just let out a slow breath, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled away without another word. He waited until the last set of headlights disappeared down the road before turning back toward his house. His land was his again. But as he stepped onto his porch, exhaustion settling deep in his bones, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last he'd hear of Karen Berkeley. Not by a long shot. Lance stood at the edge of his property as the last traces of Karen's presence disappeared down the road, her taillights fading into the distance like a bad dream finally breaking apart in the morning light. The land was his again, but the victory felt less like a celebration and more like the slow release of a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. The damage she had done wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something that had shaken the very foundation of the life he had spent years building. She had come onto his land like a storm, disrupting everything in her path, and now that she was gone, he was left with the aftermath, the quiet wreckage of a battle fought not with fists or weapons, but with manipulation, legal loopholes, and a relentless determination to take what wasn't hers. The first thing he did was secure the property. The camp had been dismantled, but there were still remnants of their occupation trash left behind, makeshift signs stuck in the dirt, patches of land that had been trampled down by people who had no respect for the ground they walked on. He spent the next several days clearing it all out, hauling away the debris, repairing fences, and restoring order to the parts of the farm that had been disrupted by their presence. It was tedious work, the kind that left his hands sore and his muscles aching, but it was necessary. He needed to erase every trace of what had happened, to reclaim every inch of space they had tried to steal. But physical repairs were the easy part. The real damage, the kind that couldn't be fixed with a hammer and some elbow grease, had been done behind the scenes in courtrooms and government offices where Karen had left her mark long before she had even stepped foot on his property. She had filed petitions, made legal claims, stirred up enough bureaucratic chaos that, even with her gone, there were still loose ends to tie up. His lawyer kept him updated on the progress, working tirelessly to make sure every one of Karen's fraudulent filings was overturned, every false claim dismantled before it could gain any real traction. It was a slow process, but one by one, the obstacles she had tried to put in his way were removed. The conservatorship petition was denied, the environmental complaints dismissed, the zoning requests struck down before they could be pushed through. In the end, everything she had tried to build collapsed just as quickly as the camp itself. Still, Lance couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't the kind of person to disappear quietly. For weeks he half expected to see her car parked at the edge of his property, to find new legal threats arriving in the mail, to wake up one morning and discover some new scheme she had cooked up to try and worm her way back in. But the weeks passed, then a month, then two, and there was nothing. Just silence. It should have felt like relief, but it didn't. Karen had spent so much time convincing herself that she was untouchable, that she was destined for something greater than the laws that governed everyone else, and people like that didn't just give up. The confirmation came in the form of a news article, a short piece buried in the back pages of the local paper. Former community organizer under investigation for fraud. It turned out Karen had been busy long before she ever set foot on Lance's farm. She had been running the same game in other places, manipulating legal systems, filing fraudulent claims, convincing people to buy into her vision of a world where ownership was just a formality, a technicality that could be bent to suit her needs. But she had finally pushed too far, crossed the wrong line, and now she was being forced to answer for it. Lance read the article twice, then folded the paper and set it aside. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt tired. He had won, but the victory had come at a cost. There had been days when he had felt like a stranger on his own land, when the place that was supposed to be his refuge had been invaded, tainted by people who had no right to be there. And even now, even with her gone, he couldn't shake the knowledge that it had happened once, and that meant it could happen again. So he adapted. He installed new security measures, reinforced his property lines, made sure that if anyone ever tried to pull something like this again, they wouldn't get past the gate. He strengthened his ties with the local community, making sure that if trouble ever came knocking again, he wouldn't be fighting it alone. And most importantly, he stayed ready. Because the world was full of people like Karen, people who thought they were entitled to take whatever they wanted, who saw laws and boundaries as mere suggestions rather than rules. But this was his land, and no one was ever going to take it from him again.